Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Brandy Noneke, the director of the Citrus Policy Lab, where we support interdisciplinary tech policy research and engagement. I'd like to welcome you all to the 13th year of the Citrus Research Exchange Seminar Series and 21 years of the Citrus organization. We have hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators in person at Sutarchadai Hall and are glad to see all of you joining virtually today for the Fall 2021 series. Before we begin the talk, I want to first highlight a few upcoming Citrus events. The next Citrus Research Exchange will be held on Wednesday, October 6th from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific time for a discussion on doing inclusive design from Gender Meg to Inclusive Meg with Professor Margaret Burnett from the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Oregon State University. You can check out the Citrus webpage for the sign up. Today, we are joined by Shara Tibken. Shara Tibken is managing editor of CNET News in San Francisco. In her role, she oversees a team of reporters as well as covers the mobile device industry and the digital divide. Before joining CNET, Shara wrote about technology in the stock market for Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal in New York. She grew up on a farm in rural Iowa and graduated from Simpson College in Indianola in 2007. The poor internet connectivity in her hometown inspired Shara's interest in the broadband gap. I'm going to post one of Shara's recent articles on digital redlining in the chat for you all to access. But it is my great honor to welcome you, Shara Tibken, and I will pass it over to you.
Great, thank you. Just a sec, I'll figure out the screen share, so bear with me, everyone. There we go, I think. Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for hosting me and for attending this talk. As Brandy noted, I work for CNET News. My colleagues and I have been writing about the digital divide for the past few years. When I was working on this article that she shared about how internet and when I was working on this article about digital redlining, I came across that because I had been looking into the issue of internet affordability. And I kept hearing about this issue that I couldn't actually believe still existed in 2021. And that issue is called digital redlining. The phrase can mean a lot of things, but in my article and in this talk, I specifically am looking at how low-income people of color don't have access to high-speed internet in their neighborhoods. They live in some of the same areas that couldn't get home loans in the 1930s because of racist policies that particularly hurt Black residents. Before we start, just a disclosure, I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist. I approached this topic as a reporter. I talked to a lot of really smart people from nonprofits, think tanks, governments, companies, academics, basically you name it. So I'm sharing some of that information with you today. In the time allotted, I can't possibly cover every aspect of this issue, but I hope this gives you a good introduction to the problem. At the end of the presentation, I've shared a slide with some good resources if you want to learn more about digital redlining. As we begin, I'm going to start with an overview of the situation, move on to talking about the digital divide overall, give a brief history of redlining and explain why it's happening again. And finally, we'll look at some of the efforts to stop this practice. Oops. There we go. Before we get into the specifics of what's happening with redlining, I wanted to start with a question. So when you think about areas and people that don't have fast home internet, what do you picture? You're probably thinking of places like this slide. So this is my home state of Iowa and also Brandy's as well. Internet service in some areas of Iowa is almost non-existent. Some of the more remote parts fall into what's called the digital divide or broadband gap. So these areas don't have internet that's at least 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. For a while, the top speed at my parents' house was about 3 megabits per second down. So this chart shows you what Netflix requires in order to play different content. You can't play HD video unless you have at least 5 megabits per second. And even at 5, your picture will probably take a while to load. It could stutter, kind of that buffering issue that we were used to from a long time ago. Other parts of Iowa, though, have extremely fast internet. My brother and sister-in-law live down the road from my parents, and they have gigabit fiber built directly into their farmhouse. So their service is actually faster than what a lot of people have in downtown San Francisco. This situation shows the problem with internet connectivity in the US overall. In one home, you could have spotty service, but your neighbor could have fiber. And this isn't just happening in remote farmland. It's happening in places like East Cleveland, Ohio, and it's happening in places like the public housing apartments in Los Angeles. A big reason why high-speed internet doesn't exist in parts of cities like Cleveland and LA is the cost. Internet is expensive in the United States, and for a lot of people, it costs too much for them to pay $70 or $100 for service. Because people can't pay that amount, and service providers don't really want to expand their networks there. So they kind of keep their old legacy slow networks around. So instead of having fast home internet, people living in the center of huge cities may only have those kind of old DSL networks. They're often so slow that users can barely stream a show on Netflix, let alone handle multiple people on Zoom at once. Working from home while your kids are taking classes would be almost impossible. And that service usually costs as much as fiber, which is kind of crazy. So many times the places that are ignored by service providers in cities are the same areas that were denied loans or insurance based on race. In the 1930s, banks started developing maps to withhold loans for high risk, undesirable inhabitant types, is how it was phrased. Those risky investments were almost always people of color. This policy expanded to insurance, healthcare, and other services, and it was called redlining. Today's version, when it comes to tech, is known as digital redlining. Unlike mortgage redlining, it's not illegal, but it's hurting people of color in similar ways. So if you look at this slide, there's this organization in California called the Greenlining Institute. So it's literally the opposite of redlining is their mission. It looked at internet connectivity throughout California. And what it found was that areas that were redlined by banks in the past are digitally redlined by internet service providers today. So that includes Oakland. On the map on the left, you'll see is a historical redlining map of Oakland. So it's actually Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, the East Bay of California. And the red areas were areas that had high Black populations and were considered not good investments for mortgages. If you look at the map on the right, that shows internet service in Oakland today, or I guess 2020. The areas that are in kind of that orangish and red color are areas where a lot of the people do not have fast internet in their homes. And you'll notice that these maps look very similar, both in terms of the colors. There's really no great data on how prevalent digital redlining is. Studies have found that it happens in cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, Dallas, Detroit, LA, Oakland, other parts of California, basically you name it. There's an organization called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and it publishes a report about the worst connected cities in America. So its most recent report covers data from 2019. And what it showed was that the top 20 cities with the least access to broadband, which includes mobile, all had poverty rates of at least 10%. A lot of them, the poverty rates were much higher. And at the same time, all but 2 had high percentages of people of color. This is based off data from the 2019 American Community Survey. The Census Bureau released that information last September. We may not know how prevalent digital redlining is, at least like statistically, but there was an interesting report from last year that shared a breakdown of kids who don't have internet based on their race or ethnicity. So if you look at this slide, this came from several organizations worked together to compile this data as schools were trying to figure out how to handle life in a pandemic. What they found was that lack of high-speed home internet access disproportionately affects children of color. About 34% of American Indian and Alaska Native families don't have high-speed home internet. and about 31% each of Black and Latino families don't have high-speed home internet. For white families, the percentage is 21%. This bottom chart shows the breakdown by income. About 45% of households making less than $25,000 a year don't have high-speed home internet. That really raises the risk that these kids will fall behind their peers. During the early days of the pandemic, and for a very long time in California, most schools were remote. How are you supposed to take classes if you don't even have internet in your home? A lot of schools were handing out hotspots or trying to find other ways to solve this problem, but a hotspot isn't really a replacement for a fast wired home connection. There is some hope the situation will change. The federal government has allocated $65 billion as part of the new $1 trillion infrastructure plan to make sure every American has broadband access. Affordability will be a big part of that. The funds could get companies to build in areas they previously avoided. So now they could actually get federal funding to kind of close these gaps that exist in their networks. The funding could also get new internet providers to serve those neighborhoods. Before, competing was just too hard against the incumbents. In the plan, the Biden administration specifically calls out digital redlining. At the same time, a congresswoman from New York in July introduced a bill to prohibit digital redlining. These are big steps in acknowledging that this is a problem. So to kind of understand the situation with internet in the US, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. I talked about the broadband gap or digital divide early on in this, and I'm sure you've all been hearing it in the media, from the government, just people talking about it. It's the reality that millions of Americans don't have high-speed internet at home. There are really three main reasons for it. The first is that there's no infrastructure in the neighborhoods. Second is that people don't have service because they can't afford it. And third is they don't have service because they don't know how to access it. These are all issues that play into digital redlining. Over the past few years, closing the digital divide has become a major focus of the federal government. As I mentioned, there's all, that $65 billion going around. There is just one major problem though. We don't actually know where the gaps are. That is because of how the Federal Communications Commission previously collected data from internet service providers. So here are a couple maps put together by Microsoft that kind of show you the discrepancy in terms of the data that we have. So the map on the left comes from the FCC. What it does is it collects data from internet service providers every 6 months. And what the service providers have to do is say where they could provide service within 10 business days. This doesn't mean that they do have service in those areas, but that they could, within 10 days, set it up. The data is provided at the census block level, which is the smallest geographic area used by the US Census Bureau. In rural areas, a census block could be miles. In cities, it's smaller, but it still isn't very granular. And the problem with this map was if one home in the census block could get service, the whole block is considered served. That means it's not eligible for public funding, and any possible competitors who are looking at the area would see the map and say, oh no, this is already served by XYZ company. The FCC's most recent report came out in January, and it had numbers that included information through the end of 2019. So what it determined was that fewer than 14.5 million Americans, or only 4.4% of the population, lacks access to fixed broadband. The Biden administration, in its recent moves, has said that the number is closer to 30 million Americans who live in an area with no broadband infrastructure. Then we come to the map on the right. Microsoft thinks that this problem is even bigger. Instead of getting information from service providers, what it did was look at how quickly people across the US downloaded software and security updates. So it's seeing how people are actually using the internet. What it found was that in June, only about 120 million people, or more than a third of the US population, do not use the internet at broadband speeds. So obviously there's a huge difference between these estimates. The FCC National Broadband Map is basically making millions of people invisible. That was how Microsoft phrased it. The issue is we don't know that people don't even have service, so how can it get fixed? Unless the data gets better, these people are likely to remain invisible. You'll notice a lot of the stats that I use in this presentation are based on data from 2019. These bad maps and data collection practices are why. The country is making policies and allocating funding based on information that's often out of date by the time it's published. As you can imagine, the faulty maps are a reason why lower income areas don't have service, even with all of the funding available. Remember that if one home in the census block can get internet, it's considered served. So the areas aren't eligible for more funding to help build out infrastructure. And providers in the area don't want to build there either because they don't think they'll make money. One of the first ways to stop digital redlining is by knowing where the problems are. The Congress in December allocated $65 million to fix these maps. So the FCC will now require internet service providers to share more detailed data. This will give a better picture of what areas are unserved. The FCC also has to open its map to public feedback. So this is going to let people flag when something is wrong, and it will also collect more data points to really understand the situation. This new map could take a year or even 2 to get created. So states have been making their own broadband maps to figure out where to devote resources. In February, acting FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel launched a new task force to fix this data. She said at the time that it's no secret that the FCC's existing broadband maps leave a lot to be desired. My colleague Maggie Reardon published an article today on CNET that features an interview with the acting chairwoman. She specifically asked about digital redlining, and Rosenworcel said that one of the first things to do about this issue is to improve the maps. So that's a really big focus of the FCC right now. One thing that the maps haven't done in the past and probably will not do in the future is track how much internet service actually costs. They also can't tell you how many people could get service but don't have it because they can't afford it. Last year, the New America Foundation's Open Technology Institute published a cost of connectivity study that looked at internet prices around the world. What is probably not surprising is that they found out that the US has the highest average monthly internet prices when compared to other countries in North America, Europe, and Asia. So here in the US, we pay on average about $84 a month. That includes about $68 for the service itself and about $16 for equipment rental fees. So that's the modem and router and the equipment that you need to get online. Pew Research has also looked into this issue a lot. What it said from a survey in April 2020 was that roughly half of Americans with lower incomes worried about paying their broadband and cell phone bills over the coming months. And in June of this year, another Pew report said that 43% of adults with household incomes below $30,000 didn't have home broadband. So now to kind of explain the redlining aspect of digital redlining, I'm going to do a little bit of a history lesson and go back to the origins of mortgage redlining. So after the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the federal government wanted to help lower income afford homes. So that sounds great. They created the National Housing Act of 1934 to introduce long-term mortgages and low fixed interest rates. This relied on maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation to identify people who probably would not default if they were given a loan. Those maps were color-coded. In practice, this was not so great for Black people and other people of color. The maps contained areas in red that were deemed to be undesirable for mortgages, and most people living in the red areas were Black or immigrants. That designation made it basically impossible for them to buy or refinance homes. And this is where the term redlining comes from. For banks and insurers, they said they wanted to protect their bottom lines, but the racist practice resulted in entire communities, many of them Black, being denied loans, coverage, or other services. Because it was hard to get a home loan, landlords abandoned those areas, city services went away, and property values dropped. White people moved to the suburbs, and for 30 years, about 98% of loans were given only to white people. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 made redlining illegal, but the old policies are still affecting people today. One of the main ways to be financially stable in the United States is to own a home. That's also the main way that people pass wealth on to their children and grandchildren and future generations. If you look at this chart, I've included some stats from the Urban Institute. So what it found was that in 2019, only about 42% of Black people owned homes. That compares to 72% of white Americans. And then if you look at the family wealth, the median Black household held 1/8 the wealth of the median white households, 1/8. At the same time, it's not just wealth, it's also health and the ability to withstand the pandemic. Historically, redlined neighborhoods have lower life expectancy. They have higher incidences of chronic diseases. And these all mean that if somebody gets COVID and lives in one of these neighborhoods, it's more likely that they would end up in the hospital seriously ill or even dead. This was according to a study from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. So digital redlining is similar to traditional redlining, but it isn't outright based on race. Instead, it's based on income and corporate calculations on whether building service in a particular neighborhood or city will be profitable. In the United States, though, race is often a proxy for income. Internet providers aren't saying they're avoiding an area because it's predominantly Black. They say that they're avoiding it because they can't make money there. Internet service in the US is considered a free market service. It's not a utility like electricity, gas, or landline phone service. Internet service providers build their own networks where it makes financial sense. They set their own prices, and they compete in the market. Utilities, on the other hand, face price caps, coverage requirements, and other regulations that make sure they're accessible for everyone. Many of the areas that were redlined by banks decades ago are the same areas having trouble getting high-speed internet service today. I've said that a couple times in this, and you'll hear it again because that is the fact of what's happening. Here are a couple really great maps that I think illustrate this extremely well. So these came from a nonprofit called Digital C. It's based in Cleveland. And what it did was look at a 1940s mortgage redlining map and compared it to a broadband map from I think the most recent data was 2019. So in the area on the map on the left, the red areas were undesirable. They were majority Black neighborhoods, and they were considered risky investments. The area on the right is a map of Cleveland households without any broadband internet access. So the orange color is 40 to 50% of the people who live in those areas don't have internet. Red is 50 to 60%. And then there's a purple area, which is greater than 60% of the households do not have high-speed home internet. If you'll see, those maps look pretty similar. Red is in the same areas. Cleveland is one of the worst connected cities in America. The total population in 2019 was around 172,000 people. That year, there were nearly 53,000 people without broadband subscriptions of any type. So that included mobile and fixed. There were also 79,000 people without fixed broadband. So that means nearly half of the people in Cleveland don't have access to fast internet at home. Coincidentally, not so coincidentally, about half of Cleveland's population is Black. The city remains racially segregated, with most of its Black residents living on the east side. So on both maps, that's the area that's in red. Some of the areas in red on those internet maps have internet service called DSL. This isn't fast enough to be considered broadband, and it's basically a dying technology. When telephone lines were being set up in the US, landline telecom companies were required to provide inexpensive fixed line phone service to all homes. Many of those companies then became the first internet service providers. They were usually the only option in the area. So if you wanted internet, it was with your phone company. These companies distributed connectivity through dial-up connections and later through these digital subscriber lines that are copper cables. Those are what's known as DSL. It might have been considered speedy in the 1990s, but it was gradually replaced by faster cable broadband, and cable is now being replaced by fiber. DSL speeds typically range from about 0.5 megabits per second, which is too slow to do most tasks on the internet, to about 100 megabits per second. And you're only gonna get that top speed if you're really close to basically the main office where the connection is located. Because most DSL connections can't keep up with today's internet speeds, companies are no longer investing in those networks. They're instead building fiber or fixed wireless to serve their customers and prepare their networks for the future. Some providers are only replacing DSL with pricey fiber in wealthy areas because they know the investment will pay off. And many times DSL plans cost the same or even more than fiber. Fiber is basically what's going to ensure that home internet can adapt to things we want to do in the future, like augmented reality, virtual reality, or the metaverse, which everybody seems to be talking about lately. Could you imagine being in your own virtual world and having the picture constantly stutter or not load at all? You could miss out on a really big part of society and the modern world if you didn't have fast working internet. The reality is with DSL, you wouldn't be able to do any of that. Fiber speeds typically go up to 10 gigabits per second, which is equivalent to 10,000 megabits per second. At that speed, if you download a 2 gigabyte video file, it would take you about 1 second. If you're downloading that same file over a 40 megabits per second connection, it would take you about 7 minutes. So this slide is looking at kind of different plans that are available today in downtown San Francisco. As I noted, DSL plans cost as much as fiber, even though the speeds aren't comparable. So what I did was I looked at what was available in my first apartment when I moved to San Francisco, and I looked this up this week, so this is current. So the picture on the left is the only internet option available for internet service in my old apartment. I lived in the center of San Francisco on one of the busiest streets in the city. All that I could subscribe to was AT&T's Internet 10 plan. So you'll note that AT&T calls this plan fast, but it's only 10 megabits per second. At that speed, you can basically watch Netflix if you're the only one streaming it. But if there's a couple people using it, it won't work very well. There's really no way that you could work from home while your kids were taking remote classes. You would not have your Zoom camera on. I would definitely not be giving this PowerPoint presentation right now. That speed of 10 does not meet the federal definition of broadband, which, as a reminder, is 25 down and 3 up. Experts even believe broadband is going to get redefined to be 100 down and 100 up, based on what we're all doing on the internet now. What this slide doesn't tell you is that AT&T's Internet 10 plan also comes with only 1 megabit per second upload speeds. That is so slow. Again, I would not be doing any of this if that was my home internet speed. On top of those slow speeds, that plan costs more than the two plans on the right, which are AT&T's base fiber plans. Its plan that is 30 times faster is $10 less a month. And then, with these plans, you also have a mandatory $10 monthly equipment fee. So this is a huge issue even in San Francisco. AT&T is shutting down its DSL network, but it hasn't even upgraded downtown San Francisco, which is Silicon Valley, is supposed to be the heart of technology, and is one of the most expensive cities in the world. And if San Francisco isn't even getting fiber, what hope do less affluent areas have? The reality is this is happening in a lot of places. So again, companies are making a lot of money from DSL because they're charging basically the same as they're charging from fiber. So for them, there maybe isn't a lot of incentive to upgrade some of their customers. In many poor urban areas, they're not upgrading their networks. The service providers aren't building new infrastructure because they say they won't have enough paying customers to make money quickly. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation has done some great work on this area. And what they found was that the big publicly traded internet service providers expect to make returns on their investment in about 3 to 5 years. So that is very fast. If they're going into an area that has about 1,000 people per square mile, they should be able to make money eventually, but it may not be fast enough for what they're requiring. In rural areas and some other more remote locations, it could take 30 to 40 years to break even on these sort of infrastructure investments. So that's why there's a really big push to get state and federal funding for those areas, because these providers would not make money for decades. But even densely populated areas like Oakland or San Francisco aren't getting fiber when there are enough people per square mile to make money. So the companies that are most often accused of digital redlining tend to be former landline providers. Typically, they're not the cable companies. There's something called a franchise agreement that means that cable providers have to offer internet service to everyone in an area, and they can't ignore people. So the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley published a report in 2017 that looked at AT&T's footprint in California. And what it found was that the places that AT&T was investing money in fiber were wealthy neighborhoods. Low-income communities were staying on slow DSL. So at that time, it said about 28% of households in AT&T's California footprint were stuck with slow DSL. And the people who had DSL, their median income was $53,000, and which is 44% lower than the households with fiber. This isn't just happening in California. In 2017, citizens in Cleveland filed an FCC complaint against AT&T. They accused it of failing to serve low-income communities of color in the city. Detroit residents later filed a similar suit. What was happening in both of these places was that, according to studies by the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, was that the overwhelming majority of areas with poverty rates above 35% lacked fiber, but wealthier suburbs had it. AT&T has disputed these studies, and it said that both complaints were resolved through mediation. They were dismissed in early 2018. AT&T has said that it doesn't redline access, but it makes its investments based on the capacity needs of its network and the demand for its services. Since 2016, it has increased the availability of its fiber network nearly 5-fold. At the end of the first quarter, its fiber covered more than 14.5 million customer locations, and it plans to double the number of customer locations by the end of 2025. But even then, the NDIA and Communication Workers of America published a report last year saying that AT&T has made fiber to the home available to fewer than 1/3 of the households in its total footprint. It also said that households with AT&T fiber available have a median income 34% higher than those with DSL only. Another company that gets mentioned a lot is Frontier. Frontier has a huge DSL network, and it's making it that it hasn't really upgraded because it's making money from customers paying for those speeds. The US Federal Trade Commission and law enforcement from 6 states sued Frontier in May. What they said was the company failed to deliver DSL speeds that consumers paid for and promised. They said that Frontier actually charged consumers for more expensive and higher speed plans than it could actually provide. So Frontier has about 1.3 million DSL subscribers. Most of them are in rural areas in 25 states. It has said its lawsuit is without merit. Frontier has big plans to expand its fiber network. It's part of its plan to emerge from bankruptcy. It wants to bring its total fiber footprint to over 10 million locations by the end of 2025. Earlier this year, it was in about 3 million homes. Then there's New York. So New York, a lot of people have heard of Verizon. Now there's Verizon. A lot of people have heard about Verizon's Fios service. So this is its fiber to the home service. It had reached a deal with New York City in 2008 to install fiber everywhere to every home in the city by 2014. It did not do that. So New York sued Verizon in 2017, saying that it had only served 2/3 of the city's residences. Most unserved homes were in low-income parts of the city. New York and Verizon settled this dispute last November, and Verizon agreed to wire up to 500,000 more households with Fios. The state of New York has also taken some steps to try to make internet more affordable. In April, it passed a law that will require all internet service providers to offer high-speed internet plans to low-income families for $15 a month. Unsurprisingly, this is being battled in the courts, and so the rollout plans for that are on hold. Digital redlining may not be identical to traditional redlining, but it could have some of the same impacts. We've already talked about kids who can't take classes from home, may never catch up to their peers. They may not be able to get into good colleges or find high-paying work. Adults without fast broadband can't participate in the modern economy. They can't video chat with their doctors. They can't work from home. They can't search and apply for jobs. They're often limited to what they can do on their phones. One area that is particularly bad when it comes to service availability is public housing. Much of the public housing in the United States has no high-speed internet service. It's not just that people in those places can't afford service, but that there's no broadband infrastructure at all. So Los Angeles is one place I looked at. The public housing had no broadband service providers until last summer. There are about 6,900 units and 23,000 people, but none of them were able to use broadband. Kids were having to take classes remotely, and it was just basically impossible to do from home. Connect Home is this program from President Barack Obama that wanted to get, that still wants to get low-income people online. It published a study saying that only 1/3 of public housing households have high-speed internet access. And that takes it to mean that they have an internet connection as well as a computer, laptop, or tablet. So this photo of kids doing homework outside Taco Bell in California went viral last year. And it was kind of shocking to people, but it's a reality for a lot of Americans. When people don't have fast internet at home, they used to go to the library or do homework at school. During the pandemic, that wasn't possible. So kids have been sitting outside stores and restaurants that have public Wi-Fi, or families are relying on phones as hotspots. These solutions aren't just inconvenient, they also have less privacy and come with data security risks. For these kids, they're really struggling to keep up with their more affluent peers. This situation isn't all doom and gloom though. There are real efforts to bring attention to digital redlining and to end it. As I said earlier on, the first step is knowing where the problems actually are. The FCC is working on those bad maps and trying to make them better. In the meantime, a lot of states are mapping their own broadband connectivity to figure out who doesn't have service. That information is going to let them allocate funding to the right areas. In the past, we've seen funding go to parking lots or vacant sheds because they didn't really know where the problems were. The hope is that with the better maps, that's not going to happen. There's also work to make internet more affordable. So the government launched the Emergency Broadband Benefit from COVID relief funding earlier this year. How that works is households get $50 a month to pay for internet service. It also gives people a one-time $100 payment toward a device to connect to the internet. EBB has had some problems, but more than 900 broadband providers participate in the program, and it's led to a permanent subsidy for lower income households. More than 6 million Americans have taken advantage of it so far. The $65 billion in spending on broadband from the infrastructure bill includes more than $40 billion to build the networks, $14.2 billion for broadband affordability programs, and $2.75 billion for digital inclusion grants. So that's basically to teach people how to use technology. The new affordable connectivity program established in that legislation will give households living near the poverty line or people who are enrolled in other federal aid programs up to $30 a month for the internet package of their choice. Another possible solution to making sure everyone has broadband is classifying internet service as a utility. Right now, internet is a free market service. With Title II of the 1934 Communications Act, broadband could be reclassified as a telecommunications service. In 2015, you might remember the net neutrality battle. So at that time, the FCC used Title II, the same law, to adopt net neutrality rules, which said all internet traffic should be treated the same. It also let the FCC regulate broadband under the rules used for old telephone networks. The move made broadband a common carrier, which meant it had to be open to everyone. But after Ajit Pai became FCC chairman under President Donald Trump in 2017, one of the first things he did was reverse this. He reversed net neutrality and deregulated broadband. So the current FCC can seek to reverse the reversal, but the Biden administration has to appoint a fifth tiebreaker commissioner if it wants to do that. If Title II is enacted, it could let the FCC regulate the broadband industry in a similar way to utilities. It could protect consumers, ensure service quality, make sure service providers offer affordable plans, require those plans to cover everyone. But it would be a real big battle to be able to do this. Even when the FCC passed net neutrality in 2015, it didn't adopt other aspects of Title II, like setting price caps on broadband service. Internet service providers argue that it doesn't make sense for internet to be a utility. They say their industry is ultra competitive, that speeds are getting faster all the time. There's always new providers. This is in the words of a trade group, US Telecom, the Broadband Association. So it lobbies on behalf of AT&T, Frontier, Verizon, Cisco. It noted that broadband providers have invested $1.8 trillion over the past 25 years on infrastructure. And today they're investing over $80 billion a year. If they weren't able to make money from this service, they say they wouldn't be able to make those investments. One thing that is improving the situation right now is public-private partnerships. And these sort of programs are happening all over the US. So in LA, the situation started to change when a company called Starry wanted to put its broadband towers on the top of public housing. So its low-cost digital equity arm called Starry Connect ended up signing a deal with the Housing Authority to provide fixed wireless internet service to over 5,000 units across 9 different public housing sites. Its speed is 30 megabits per second down and up. And instead of tying service to an individual, Starry gives you service if you're in one of those apartments. So that doesn't require credit checks. It doesn't require background checks or some of these other hurdles that people have to jump through to get internet service. Starry service also costs $15 a month. As of early summer, it had covered about 1,000 units. In Cleveland, there's other groups like Digital C and PCs for People who are working with big companies like Nokia and Microsoft to build out internet service to residents. Digital C has ambitious plans to connect 40,000 people in the city by 2025. A really good case study in how things can improve is Denver. 6 years ago, Denver looked a lot like LA when it came to internet service in its public housing. It has one of the biggest public housing communities in the Western US with 26,000 residents across 21 properties. Most people make around $10,000 a year, or the median household income is $10,000 a year. And more than 90% of the residents are people of color. Denver became part of a pilot program from Obama's Connect Home initiative when it was first getting started. Through that program, now Denver's public housing properties went from 0 internet service providers to 3. So its residents actually have more choice in internet providers than most Americans across the country. None of those providers charge more than $15 a month, including taxes and fees. Some organizations and housing authorities have pushed for the internet to be defined as a utility, but others believe competition is really the way to get lower prices and better service. When it comes to digital redlining, competition isn't probably going to solve the problem. So if you look at this slide, it's a map from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. What it found was that most Americans don't have real choice in internet providers. At least 83.3 million Americans can only access broadband through a single provider. And 70 million can only choose from one of the 6 biggest. So remember that phrase, ultra competitive. During Frontier's Investor Day presentation in August, when it said it would bring fiber to 10 million homes by 2025, it touted this stat that in 88% of its markets, it has only one or no other competitors. So that does not sound very ultra competitive. So the success of the 3 service providers in Denver public housing has gotten other big providers to approach the units to offer service to residents. They can't really come close to that $15 monthly rate the residents are paying, though. They're offering $150 internet packages to people who make less than $10,000 a year. So this really shows there's still a disconnect with reality of life in those areas. So even though competition is working in Denver and other places, it may take changes to federal and state funding eligibility to allow new providers to address areas considered covered by an incumbent. A lot of times the provider will neglect an area, but when it sees that someone else is trying to come in, it will quickly build service or vow to change. So a good example of that is Google Fiber. When the company would announce new cities like Austin, the current internet service providers would race to build faster internet so they wouldn't lose their customers. For a lot of upstart service providers, it was just too hard to compete, so they didn't. At the same time, exclusive deals still exist, where landlords will only let one company provide service in an area. The FCC formally prohibits this since 2007, but there's still some loopholes. And even though digital redlining of home broadband is being scrutinized, there are worries that this could continue with 5G. So far, redlining hasn't been a big issue with wireless service because towers cover huge distances and carriers want their customers to be able to get access no matter where they are. But 5G airwaves just can't travel as far, so towers have to be built closer together. The fastest kind of 5G is largely being built in dense cities. Other things that states and cities are looking at is funding broadband themselves. So in some places, it's legal to have municipal broadband service. Other places, that's banned. If it's banned, sometimes they're looking at ways to fund nonprofits who can provide broadband, like PCs for People in Cleveland. The hope is that with this $65 billion from the federal government, that will be better targeted at inner cities and areas that previously didn't qualify for help. Also, that Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 bill was introduced by House Representative Yvette Clarke, a Democrat from New York, in July. It would aim to empower the FCC to define and eliminate digital redlining, and it would encourage competition. That is currently in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. So we'll have to see what happens with that act. But really, for the first time, digital redlining is something lawmakers and big companies are talking about. As I noted at the start of this talk, there was really no way I could cover every aspect of digital redlining in the time we have today. But the past couple of years have shown us that high-speed internet access isn't something that's nice to have. It's something that people have to have. You need it for school, you need it for work, for healthcare, for staying connected with family and friends. In many parts of the US, people can't connect to broadband at home. And a lot of times the ones disconnected are people of color who live in areas that were redlined by banks nearly a century ago. Those neighborhoods often don't have any high-speed infrastructure available, whether residents could afford it or not. But there is hope that this could soon change. On this slide, I've included some of the amazing resources out there to learn more about the topic. This isn't comprehensive by any means, but I hope it can give you a start if you want to learn more. Thank you for tuning in today.
Great, thank you so much, Shara. This has been a completely sobering discussion today about where we are in the state of broadband deployment in the United States. And I have many questions that I've written down. I see some questions already going into the Q&A box, so I encourage everybody to please post your questions there. I'm going to kick us off with a couple of questions up for, to get us started. So you talked a lot about the broadband maps. And I know that we have the Broadband Data Act, which mandated the FCC to update its maps. And I will also put in the chat the maps for people to take a look at. And you also mentioned that some states are also developing their own mapping. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, what do you think are the benefits and risks of states also doing their own broadband mapping? I'm just going to foreshadow. I'm just thinking, what if they're using different methodology and now you're trying to compare across states? But what do you think are the benefits and risks of doing that?
The biggest benefit is that these maps don't really exist. So somebody had to do it. When you're looking at a lot of these places, there's literally billions of dollars of funding. But if you're a state trying to figure out where to send that, it's very, very difficult. So a lot of these, I've talked to a lot of different states about what they're doing, and it's really interesting because a lot of them are approaching it the same way. They're sharing information. So it's not like somebody's doing something crazy and others are looking at other things. Georgia is often credited for having one of the best maps, like most detailed maps. What they did was they actually, they passed this law to protect service provider information. And that got the service providers to actually share with them address data. And then they worked with this real estate data company to figure out what those addresses were. So like they could see like, oh, this address is actually a vacant parking lot. It's not an apartment that needs wired. So that one was just like this extremely granular map that I don't think anybody else really has that level. Others are using things like maybe they'll get some data from service providers, but then they'll also get, maybe they'll use like speed test data or insight from people. Speed test data is a big thing people are using because service providers don't really want to share this information. That real estate mapping company that worked with Georgia, it's talked with other states as well. And it said that service providers are becoming even more resistant. I think people are catching on to the fact that states are trying to do this and service providers don't really want to share the information. They have to share the information with the FCC, but again, it's not at the address level. And the FCC map could take so long to get done that there's funding now. There's billions of dollars in funding now. So you can't wait a year or two for that. So these maps are really a necessity. It's not like the states really wanted to do this. They had to do it.
Yeah, you're raising such good points because these maps truly dictate the allocation of billions of dollars for investment in broadband infrastructure. And if they are incorrect, then you don't have areas served that need to be served. One other thing I wanted to touch base on, I was so happy that you brought up Title I and Title II classification. In the Communications Act under the Obama administration, the FCC reclassified broadband as a Title II common carrier service rather than under Title I information service. We saw that reversed under the Trump administration and Chairman Pai's FCC. And this is really important because classification under Title II really puts in a lot of safeguards that will support broadband investment in underserved areas. And I'm wondering, what do you think under the leadership of Jessica Rosenworcel in the current FCC? Are we going to see a reversal again of the reversal? Are we going to move back to classifying broadband under Title II?
Biden has said that he's interested in net neutrality. So I'm hoping that extends to this. Digital redlining is definitely something that Jessica Rosenworcel and the Biden administration are paying attention to. she's still just the acting chairwoman. She hasn't even been made permanent yet. And there's that fifth spot that's still open. So that she either has to be made permanent or another permanent chair has to be added before we can even start thinking about reversing it. So those are kind of some things that have to happen first. But I think that these are big, important things that the administration is really looking at.
Yeah, I think we're in a promising moment right now, but yeah, you're right. There's all of these other things that have to be put in place. So one other thing I wanted to touch base on, you said that, the average amount for a subscription is about $84 a month. And we know that there are federal subsidy programs like Lifeline, which provides a subsidy for broadband access. Now, the stats that I've seen, it's something like less than 20% of eligible households even apply and receive Lifeline. And then you also talked about the Affordable Connectivity Program that would offer $30 per month. Is this actually in line with the actual cost? Are these households able to get a lower rate of service provision because they qualify for these programs? Or is this a subsidy that's just too low for these households?
It really depends on who your provider is. So Comcast, for instance, has this Internet Essentials program, and I believe it's $20 or $10 a month. I'm forgetting right now, but I think
it's 10.
Yeah, I think it's 10. I think you're right. And so in that case, yeah, that's totally affordable. But if you have an $80 plan from someone else, $30 isn't really going to be enough to help somebody who's extremely low income afford that. So that's why we see things like what the state of New York did, which was require every internet service provider to have a $15 a month plan. That obviously is being fought. But, I would say like the subsidies, at least it's something, at least it's a first effort. There have definitely been some problems with like the emergency broadband benefit. It's been hard for people to sign up. Carriers are upselling them on more expensive plans. When I talked to the Denver Public Housing Authority, one thing I asked was whether they were encouraging their residents to sign up for the emergency broadband benefit. Because even though they were only paying $15 or less a month for rent, if you have no income, that's too much. I talked to people who lived in public housing who, said like, if it's like $10 or so, you can collect cans and do other things to try to make that money, kind of almost hustle to try to pay it. But, you'd think something like a subsidy, like the emergency broadband benefit would really help the people living there. But what the housing authority said was they were not encouraging people to sign up for it because who knew when it was going to end? It was difficult to sign up for. There were just a lot of unknowns. And so it really wasn't a practical solution for a lot of really low income people.
Yeah. And your point earlier where you gave the statistic from Frontier, where they said, in most of our markets, like 80%, it's we have one competitor or none.
Yeah.
So yeah, it looks like, okay, well, these households really don't have a choice. They have to go with a provider that services their area. And if it's $80 a month and they only get a $50 subsidy, well, they have to make up the difference.
Yep.
I want to turn quickly to one of the questions that was posted in the chat. Could you talk about the effect of age on the digital divide? Older people are not necessarily using computers or smartphones. What does it look like for older adults?
Yeah, I don't have any specific stats about older adults, but that's definitely a topic that I've been looking into a lot recently. So like Denver, for instance, a lot of the people in the public housing there are elderly people. And that's a huge part of the problem with the digital divide is a lot of people just don't know how to use the service. So we saw even just signing up for vaccines, you had to do it online. How are you going to do that if, first of all, you don't have a connection or a computer? And then secondly, you don't know how to use them. This was a life-saving product that people needed. And the way to do it was signing up online. Communities had to find other ways to help elderly people sign up for vaccinations, but it was, it is a big, serious concern. Part of the infrastructure plan and that $65 billion is nearly $3 billion to help with programs to teach people how to use technology. And I know seniors are something that is getting a lot of focus from companies who specifically work on digital literacy sort of programs.
Right. And then to end us here today, you raised three main points about access. Infrastructure, you need that first. You can't access the internet without infrastructure. You also need affordability, and then also education on how to use the technology. So there's a lot of work moving forward, but thank you so much for outlining some of the challenges and opportunities today. Thank you for joining us, Shara. We're so grateful to have you. Today's presentation has been recorded and will be made available on the Citrus YouTube channel. I encourage all of you to check out our future Citrus Research Exchange seminars. You can visit our website to see our lineup of speakers. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.